3, which focuses on the high priest Joshua. So there's a confrontation, if you will. Satan has this discussion, and he accuses Joshua of being inappropriate, not the right guy for the job, and he says he's got inappropriate clothing. And from a distance, it seems like, what the heck's he talking about here? What's the relevance of this, either to our today, first century, 5th century? So we'll take a look. I think this is a very dynamic and powerful lesson that we're going to learn here, with a lot of applicability to the Lord Jesus Christ in his role as a high priest. So by way of introduction, Joshua and Jesus are the same name. So Jesus is an anglicization, or it's basically the Greek form of Joshua from the Hebrew, so it's Yeshua. So they're one and the same name. And we'll see the similarities, I think, towards the end of the class, a powerful similarity between Joshua, the high priest in the Old Testament, and Jesus, the high priest in the New Testament. So 3 things I want you to take away from today. Again, Zechariah largely focuses on a crisis of leadership, a failure of leadership. The priesthood had let the people down significantly. Almost from the time of Aaron onwards, if you look up priesthood in the Old Testament, more often than not, it's not a pretty picture. We'll take a look at why Joshua was the right man for the job. So he and Zerubbabel are instrumental in the restoration of Judah. And finally, we'll take a look at the opposition they faced and how they handled opposition and adversaries. So vision number 4 of the 8 visions that Zechariah portrays, smack dab in the middle is vision number 4. It's Joshua the high priest. So again, the 2 principal leaders at this time are Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel the governor. Zerubbabel gets a lot more airtime. In the book of Ezra, he's called Sheshbazzar, which is the Persian form of Zerubbabel. But he's also what I would call a working leader. He was heavily involved. He laid the foundation, the cornerstone of the rebuilt temple, and he's actually cited as helping to finish the job. So from beginning to end, he's heavily instrumental. So just to give you a little backdrop what's going on here, and this is where basically Judaism as we know it was formed even up until this day. So the Sadducee is a derivative from the Greek for Sadducees, or the Hebrew form of it, and it comes from the name Zadok. So he's their predecessor, he's their ancestor, was Zadok. So the Sadducees are basically Zadokites. You'll see that in some literature. So they're just plural form of Zadok. So these guys were rich, wealthy. They completely rejected the oral law, unlike the Pharisees. Their whole life revolved around the temple. They rejected the tradition of the fathers. In contrast to the Pharisees, that was the end-all and be-all for the Pharisees, was the tradition of the fathers. So these 2 groups did not get along. They were total friction for 500 plus years, as we're going to see. Joshua, his family, his grandfather and his father were taken into exile, or his grandfather was, and he was killed by Nebuchadnezzar's troops. His father was taken into exile, and ultimately, when Joshua arrives on the scene 70 years later, he's cited as being a son of Jehozadak, a descendant of Zadok. Unlike his forebears, who were very wealthy, very powerful, influential, he was in exile from Babylon. He represented his peers and people who'd come out of exile. They were extremely poor, ironically. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were basically rabbis. They believed the temple was essentially unimportant. The most important aspect of their religious life was the Torah. So let's see what else. So in contrast to the Sadducees, again, very rich. You see that in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. He's dressed in purple, extremely wealthy, well off. By the time you get to Joshua in exile, he's very poor. The Pharisees were very poor. They were considered to be the lowest class of citizens. They lived in the worst conditions in Jerusalem, in ancient Jerusalem. So you can see a lot of friction there between rich and poor. And James, who's a descendant of Zerubbabel, picks up on that whole argument in the book of James. The Pharisees considered themselves traditional followers of Ezra. So Judaism, as we know it in the modern form, found its roots here in the time of the exile. The big issue, contemporary, so again, Haggai and Zerubbabel and Zechariah at the same time. So the big issue in Haggai is the issue of unclean. So they pose questions to Haggai and say, if we touch somebody who's got a dead body or unclean, do we become unclean if we touch something that's considered unclean? And Haggai says, yeah, it's with this people. You're unclean. This whole issue of uncleanness resonates for the next 500 years. So by the time you get to the New Testament, they're still having these arguments. What makes a person unclean? Jesus comes along to clarify what makes a person unclean. It's not what you touch. It's not the externals. It's what's in here. So we'll see that. So it's from a contemporary perspective, it's a big issue. What makes a man or a woman unclean? And so again, Haggai's perspective was, you guys, you may think you're clean, but really what's going on inside, you're unclean, everything you do. If you turn over to the book of Isaiah, I'll give you for instance. This just illustrates the problem. Isaiah 65, verses 4 and 5. So they're sacrificing in the gardens. They're burning incense on the altars of brick. In verse 4, Isaiah 65, 4, they're sitting in the graves, among the graves. A Jewish person would not do that. They consider that to make them unclean. They lodge in the monuments. They eat swine's flesh. Jews do not eat bacon, right? It's pork. You don't do it. These guys are eating pork. They're eating bacon. They're drinking broth of abominable things. The paradox is this, in verse 5. I'm thinking, you guys are totally unclean from head to foot. And what does he say here, Isaiah? They stood by themselves. They come not near to me, for I am holier than thou. They consider themselves better than everybody else. So I'm thinking, you're worse than everybody else. And we'll see what happens here in terms of uncleanness. That's the point they never got. So the book of Zechariah deals with these issues about uncleanness, and the book ends with that, about God wants us to be holy. So in other words, cleanness is not contagious. If I wash my hands and somebody else is dirty, if I put my hands on them, it's not going to make them clean. But if I've got dirty, oily, or greasy hands and I touch somebody else, it's going to leave a mark. And that's what he's telling them is, you guys are contaminating with your immorality and idolatry the people around you. So it's one of the major problems in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah is that the priesthood was unclean. You can see numerous references here as well as from Ezekiel. So Ezra chapter 2, the priesthood's unclean. Nehemiah 7:64, the priesthood's unclean. The book of Nehemiah ends, chapter 13. They've desecrated the priesthood. It was in shambles. So again, a crisis of leadership. They let them down. They became worse than the worst. It's just ironic. That's the climate and the arena in which Zerubbabel and Joshua go into to help clean up the mess that's been made. Ezra says, the officials approached him and they said, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites, both workers and assistants, have not separated themselves from the people of the lands with their abominations. They'd basically become Canaanites. So again, if you go to Hosea chapter 12, verse 7, most versions, King James and others will say merchants, but literally the word is Canaanites. They had become Canaanites, and that would have been abominable to them to be considered to be Canaanites. They basically became one and the same with the people of the land. So Joshua and Zerubbabel are trying to clean up the mess. So the night vision in Zechariah 3 that we're going to consider this morning is a reminder that the re-emergence of the worshiping community of the exiles from Jerusalem and Judah was only made possible by the grace of Yahweh. Because again, they were ritually and otherwise unclean. So he had to clean up the situation. And it doesn't happen by works, blood, sweat, and tears. It was only by the grace of God. And so the center of the argument that's cited here in Zechariah chapter 3, as well as Jude verse 9, is this argument here. It's so cryptic. If you didn't go back, if you're reading that in Jude, he just says, the Lord rebuke you, Satan. You're thinking, what the heck's going on? The verse got totally butchered by scholars after the first century. But the essence of the argument is the Lord rebuke you. The Lord has chosen Jerusalem. That's the argument. It's something to do with Jerusalem and the people in Jerusalem. And he said, is not this a brand plucked from the fire? So a brand is basically a burnt or charred wood poker. That's all that was left from the exile. The people that came out from Jerusalem and Judah was basically they were burnt. Because again, we read that the other day, everything was burnt down. The temple was just torn down, burnt. Their houses, their royal palaces. It was an apt description, in 20 words, to say, look, you guys are like a burnt piece of wood. That's all that's left. And they were saying, you guys are unfit. You don't look the part. You're wearing dirty clothes, filthy clothes. You should not be representing us as the high priest. So I'll just read this. This is succinctly put. It says, then he showed me, this is Zechariah 3, 1-3. He showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. Keep that in your mind because that's also going to figure prominently in the life of Jesus. The Lord said to Satan, the Lord rebuke you, O Satan. The Lord has chosen Jerusalem, rebuke you. Is this not a piece of charred wood plucked from a fire? Now Joshua was dressed in filthy clothes as he stood before the angel. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of high priests. They got beautiful garb, it's purple robes, nice white turban, and they're looking at him and thinking, really? Like, you don't even deserve to be in this building, let alone amongst us, and to be our leader. So all the while in this fourth vision, Satan represents their adversaries, and there was a lot of them. You see that in both Ezra chapter 4, verse 1. Now, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, so they're right there while it's being rebuilt, as well as the wall later on in Nehemiah's time. Nehemiah mentions the same thing. Our adversaries, they shall not know neither see till we come in the midst of them and slay them and cause the work to cease. So the ironic thing is the leader, Sanballat, figures prominently in the book of Nehemiah. So Sanballat was the governor of Samaria. Samaria was located north of Jerusalem. Their place of worship was Mount Gerizim. Their home base was Shechem. So again, about 20 miles north of Jerusalem. You see this come into place when Jesus talks to the woman from Samaria. They thought, we're followers of Jacob. This is what his home base was Shechem, so we're going to worship there. We're children of Jacob. They consider themselves children of Israel, both Ephraim and Manasseh. Sanballat figures prominently, so he's the governor of Samaria. He's both described as an enemy, and he's related by marriage to the family of Judah, the high priest, ironically. So they had infiltrated both their religion and they were also external adversaries. So that's the power play going on here in the book of Zechariah. So again, if you look at this, when the Septuagint was written about 250 BC, it's useful for us as New Testament readers. It's got a lot of the same language that we would be comfortable with. So in Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1, it describes their adversaries, or the Satan as both being an adversary as well as later a false accuser. This will figure prominently when it comes to Jesus, both people who oppose him and people who slander him. So there's a lot of adversaries. Again, it's plural, so there's more than one. But the Satan in Zechariah 3 just represents all of them. He's a representative, just like Joshua is a representative of the people. There's two opposing sides here. So the adversaries were opposing the returned exiles and their work to rebuild the temple. They employ about 10 different psychological tools of psychological warfare, all the way from surveillance, infiltration, distortion, discouragement, intimidation, corruption. They pulled every trick out of the bag to try and stop these guys, and they were successful. So they stopped working on the temple in about 536. So for 16 years, they stopped. People just got discouraged and think, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm out of here. So that's when Zechariah, Joshua, and Zerubbabel come on the scene, is to re-encourage the people. The book's about encouragement, right? And they're trying to get them to get re-engaged and to rebuild. So Joshua's family, his grandfather Sariah was killed by Nebuchadnezzar. His father Jehozadak was dragged away into exile. So as one writer puts it, all those whose parents or themselves survived the exile were practically brands or wood pokers, charred wood, who survived the fire, and they were rescued in the very last moment. Joshua represented and typified his fellow people. He wasn't separate from them. He wasn't holier than thou. He was one of them. So when you get to the book of Jude, he talks about Michael the archangel and fighting over the body of Moses, and that's got totally perverted and twisted over time. People weren't fighting over the literal physical body of Moses. Actually, Michael the archangel figures prominently in this era of biblical history. If you read the book of Daniel, chapter 8, 9, and 10, Michael's involved in the safety and the protection and the resurgence of Israel. What they're fighting over is the welfare and the survivability of the people of Israel. So it's analogous, the body of Moses, to the body of Christ. So in Jeremiah's time, it states that Sanballat was very angry when he learned that we were rebuilding the wall. He flew into a rage and he mocked the Jews, saying in front of his friends and the Samaritan army officers, again, he's the governor, he says, "What does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they're doing? Do they think they can build the wall in a single day just by offering a few sacrifices? Do they actually think they can make something out of stones from a rubbish heap and from charred wood at that?" So again, that's how the Samaritans, I thought, you guys are in a deplorable state. You're just, it's a rubbish heap. What the heck do you guys think you're doing? What do you think you can do? This figures prominently when we get to the book of Jude. So again, Michael and Satan, the adversaries, were disputing over the body of Moses. It wasn't some nonsensical viewpoint here, but rather it's a way succinctly to describe what was going on. And you'll notice that whole depiction in Jude in verse 9 says, "And the Lord rebuke you." Your antenna should go right up. Like, where have I ever heard that before? You should go back to Zechariah chapter 3. That's where he's pulling this from. So Jude, the context is they're having a problem with leadership, and people are disparaging leaders in the church, and they think they're slandering them. That's what happened in the time of Joshua and Zerubbabel, and it's happening in the time of Jude. So, as one writer put it, Zechariah chapter 3, verse 2, the fire refers to the Babylonian captivity. Metaphorically, Israel was snatched as a burning stick from that fire. You saw the language that Sanballat describes them. You guys are just a burnt stick. You're a rubbish heap. This is a picture, obviously, of Daniel's three friends that pulled out of the fire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Israel was in the fire, both literally and metaphorically. So you get to chapter 3, as one writer put it, we must therefore not refer the issues and the implications of Zechariah 3 to Joshua as an individual, nor merely to Joshua the high priest. We must conclude that his condition is Israel's condition, his acquittal a typical way of expressing theirs. The words of comfort and assurance were given to him apply to them. He was an exile. They were exiles. He was their leader. He didn't say, I'm better than you guys. He wasn't ashamed to call them brothers. He was there to help them because he had that same condition. So, and the condition was this. It says Joshua was clothed with filthy garments. So when you get to the New Testament, it uses the same language. The Septuagint, it uses the same language as the Septuagint, the same words. So I'll just read the NLT version at the bottom of James 2, verse 2. So again, James was related to Zerubbabel and their family line. So he said, my family was exiles. James, Jude, Jesus. They were poor, family of descendants of exiles. So James says, he talks a lot about rich and poor, and he says, when someone comes into your meeting dressed in fancy clothes and expensive jewelry, and another comes in who is poor and dressed in dirty clothes, why do you treat that guy differently? These are descendants. Remember we looked at yesterday? James is writing to the dispersed who are scattered in the dispersion of the diaspora. This is a depiction of early Judaism in the first century. So let's just get a little more real here. it might upset your Victorian sensibilities. His language is quite harsh, perhaps, but it's real. So Joshua is dressed in filthy garments. That word filthy, it's only used a few times in the Old Testament. It's basically soiled or like fecal matter. It's just dirty and just disgusting, right? It's only used 2 times in the Old Testament to describe it. And he says, he's clothed in that type of garment. Thinking, what the heck? This is our high priest. He's supposed to have beautiful, purple, long, flowing garments, and you're dressed like that? You're not fit for this job. And as I mentioned earlier, God saves them by grace. And what he does is he removes the filthy garments from Joshua, and he says, behold, I've taken your iniquity from you, and I will clothe you with pure vestments, splendid robes. So you see the contrast, and that's what God promises us. We're in filthy garments. It doesn't look too pretty. You go to the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 4, verse 13. It says basically, you guys were the scum of, it says that in several versions. You're the scum of the earth. You're just refuse. You're garbage. It's just like when they mentioned in Nehemiah, you're just like a rubbish heap. So what's interesting is in the in Greek, it's the same word that's used in the Septuagint to describe Joshua's clothing. They're filthy. It's the same word. In the King James, it says vile. That's the strong way of putting it. But it's one and the same. It's filthy. It's just dirty. And he says, Paul's using that word in relation to our body. It's not good. It's just rubbish in the sense of what God has promised on the other side of the river, so to speak. So as one writer put it, there was one major obstacle after when God corrected and rebuked Satan. He said, look, I've chosen Jerusalem. It's the city where my name is. I'm going to redeem this. It's a metaphor for human nature and life. You're thinking, why does a holy God deal with a filthy people? So he's clothed with filthy garments. The word filthy is used to describe excrement a couple of times. It designates the extreme condition of dirtiness. It's not only the exile, but sin that led the people to be considered defiled. Both the people and Joshua the high priest. So over on the right-hand side of my screen here, the word soam is the strongest expression in Hebrew language for filth and loathsome. Let's just don't dress it up, don't anesthetize it. It's nasty and it's dirty. And he says, well, there is hope for the filthy. God, no matter what the situation is, because we may feel like we're in exile, we may feel like, hey, I'm not worthy to be among you guys. I'm not holy. Well, a holy God can clean up the filthy. So the reason for Satan's accusation is Israel's impurity. Zechariah 3, verses 3 and 4, raises the problem of how a holy God can bless a filthy nation like Israel. More importantly, how a holy God can clean up the whole human race. It's a bad situation, but he can, by his grace, he can clean us up, and we can become holy people. So it's a strong lesson here in the sense it's not lost. So the parallels in Zechariah 3 and Jude are this. They're basically slandering royal dignitaries, the rulers, the first century leaders of the church. They're speaking evil of them. They're filthy dreamers. They defile the flesh. And Jude says, ultimately these are people who cause divisions and they're devoid of the Spirit. That's the contention here. Joshua's enemies were slandering him, maligning him, speaking evil of him when he's done nothing wrong. It's just the way he looked and his condition. So when you go to Jude, it says, these people, these false prophets, also rely on their dreams. They defile the flesh. They reject authority. They blaspheme the rulers or glorious ones. They blaspheme all that they do not understand. And that's the context of Michael contending with Satan for the body of Moses. And that's where you get that verse from Zechariah 3, verse 2, the Lord rebuke you. God doesn't care what you look like. If you've got filthy garments on or you're poor, he could care less. That's not what it's all about. It's in here. So he describes these people as grumblers, malcontents. They're just loudmouth boasters. The squeaky wheel gets oil here. But again, they did not emerge victorious. God cleaned up Joshua. He put beautiful clothes on him, put a white turban on his head. That's Jerusalem I've chosen, and Joshua I've chosen. That's the lesson in Zechariah. God's mercy and his sovereignty. I'm going to choose who I choose because I know what's inside of people and what's inside of a nation. I can make the dirty clean. So fast forward to Jesus. The same thing's going on. The chief priests accused him of many things. The chief priests and the scribes vehemently accused Jesus. The word accused actually is extrajudicial accusation. So there was no basis in the law to accuse them, but they made up stuff. They got false witnesses. The same thing's going on. They're falsely accusing and slandering Jesus. In Psalm 109, it's one of the so-called imprecatory psalms, where the psalmist is really ticked off at his enemies. They've slandered him and maligned him. He states in Psalm 109, verse 4, "In return for my love, they accuse me, but I gave myself to prayer. They reward me evil for good and hatred for my love. They appoint a wicked man against him. Let an accuser stand at his side." The same thing's going on. The adversaries are slandering him, accusing him, and plotting his demise. So here's an interesting thing. There's 3 Psalms in the Old Testament that speak strongly and powerfully about the Messiah. Psalm 69 and Psalm 22. Usually we just stop quoting those 2. The third one that's also quoted in the New Testament by Jesus is Luke 23:46. But the context in Psalm 41, he states, "I've heard the slander of many. Fear was on every side. While they took counsel together against me, they devised to take away my life." So what was the slander he heard all his life? It's cited in John 8:41. We're not born of fornication. We've got one Father, one God. They slandered him. They think, you're illegitimate. You could use other words for that. That's what he heard all his life. And he states in Psalm 41, it's also quoted in the New Testament, he says, "All who hate me whisper together about me. They imagine the worst for me." For his entire life, he heard people whispering and slandering him and just gossip. That was false. That's what he had to contend with. That's what's going on with Joshua. People are whispering, "This guy's dirty, he's filthy. He shouldn't even be in front of the synagogue." So Jude says the same thing. It says, these guys who are accusing Jude and other people, they're wrong. They're grumblers, they're fault finders. They really just follow their own evil desires. So again, he says at the end, verse 19, "These are people who divide you, who follow you, mere natural instincts, and they don't have the Spirit." In contrast to Joshua and Zerubbabel, who had the best interest of people, that's said of Nehemiah and Ezra, they sought the interest and the welfare of the people of Israel. That's the kind of leaders you need. That's the kind of leaders they didn't have. So, for instance, of the false prophets, Ezekiel says, "They will hunt down souls belonging to my people. Because you have been," they, says of these false prophets, "they've disheartened the righteous falsely. They've slandered them. They've maligned them." He says, "Although I have not grieved him, you have encouraged the wicked." So they dishearten the righteous and they encourage the wicked. These guys see false visions. They just make stuff up. And you see that in the New Testament. You've got leaders who led people down the wrong path to practice immorality and idolatry. So, the applicability from Joshua in the Old Testament to Jesus in the New Testament is this. You see the crossover. This woman, Bettina Fisher, she's a professor in South Africa. This is probably the best essay I've ever read on this whole issue of Zechariah and Satan. She goes, like Joshua in Zechariah chapter 3, verses 1 to 2, Jesus stands before a council to be tried on the charge concerning his identity in terms of the divine plan. In other words, when he says, "I'm the Son of God," they said, "No, you're not. You're illegitimate." Same thing with Joshua. "You're not our high priest. You're illegitimate. You're dirty. You're not the right guy for the job." He says the presiding angel of the Hebrew Bible scene in Zechariah 3 it's absent from the New Testament scene, the courtroom scene. Instead, we see successive human judges in the form of the high priest, Herod, and Pontius Pilate. At first glance, it seems that Satan in the Jesus trial is absent, but it's not so. The adversary is human nature. Whether people are, remember Joseph's brothers? They're jealous of him. They're envious of him. These guys were envious of Jesus. He threatened their power base. You see that in John chapter 12. The similarities are quite stark. The interesting thing in Zechariah 3 is this. If you're Jewish, you would dial into this immediately. It says the settings of the visions, the fourth vision in Zechariah 3 moves into the temple itself. It's the vision's in the temple. And it says, what's remarkable about this vision in Zechariah 3 is that it depicts the granting of forgiveness of sin without the use of animal sacrifice. If I was Jewish, I would say, time out, Zechariah. You're missing a big point of the story here. But Zechariah, as well as we saw that yesterday in Ezekiel 43, verses 10 to 12, he's trying to educate us on something about both sin and about forgiveness. The proof that Satan was wrong in Zechariah 3 and Joshua is to be justified lies in the following statement. Is not this a brand snatched out of the fire? And you're thinking, I have no clue what you're talking about. So God gives Satan, the adversary, proof that what he does consider is proper by pointing out that the high priest stands under his favor, under grace. Joshua was saved by grace, and other people are saved by grace. There's nothing you could do. He doesn't clean himself up. God gives him the clothing, just like when Jesus was resurrected. He's already been rescued, Joshua in the Old Testament, and recently from grave peril. A brand plucked out of the fire. They should have been annihilated and completely destroyed. But God rescued them. And because such a rescue, the man must stand in God's grace, else he would not have shown him favor. This grace is Joshua's hope. It's our hope too. Because ultimately, you're not going to do it through works, you're not going to do it through money, not strength, not intelligence. It's only ultimately, just like Joshua, we're saved by grace. What's encouraging about the vision, the fourth vision in chapter 3, when the angel says to Joshua, hear now, O Joshua the high priest, you and your friends who sit before you, they are men who are assigned. Behold, I will bring my servant the branch. They're close companions, they're close friends. They weren't repelled from him, they weren't disgusted by him. His close friends, like true friends do, they stick with you through thick and thin, no matter what you look like, no matter how badly you've screwed up. True friends are your close companions. That's the encouraging thing here, is his true friends stood by his side. In contrast, of Jesus, he was rejected by people. Even though he had blessed them and made many miracles, ultimately the leaders themselves, they rejected him and they killed him. The applicability of this to Zechariah is in chapter 11, where there's basically a play going on, and there's two shepherds. So Zechariah plays the part of a good shepherd, but the good shepherd's rejected by the people and sold for 30 shekels and just despised and rejected. They said, we want a different shepherd. So God says, okay, here's the shepherd you're choosing. It's a worthless shepherd, and he does not have your best interests at heart. He's a hireling, and he will lead you to your demise and your death. The irony here is this. Many Jewish leaders were initially rejected and afterward accepted after an extended period of absence. You think of Joseph, Moses, Joshua, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, Elijah, David, Jeremiah, and ultimately Jesus. Initially, human beings, from the time of Saul onwards, we use the wrong criteria to pick leaders. We think, he's the biggest, he's the best, he's the smartest, he's the richest. We have a bad track record of picking good leaders, and they did too. They had the wrong priests, they had the wrong shepherds, but fortunately God will rectify and remedy the problem. But when it came to Jesus, he says, I've become an exile to my brothers, an alien to my mother's sons. He was an exile in his own family. You might feel like you're an exile in your own ecclesia, your own family, but there's hope for exiles, that God will comfort us in spite of what's going on around us. That when you see in this verse here from Psalm 69, they hated him without a cause. I'm thinking, what did I do wrong? Like, why do you hate me? So one of the beautiful pictures, and we don't really ever quote this verse, is in Jeremiah 30, verse 21. He says, their princes shall be one of themselves. Just like Joshua, he's an exile, and I'm going to be your high priest. I'm in filthy garments, but I'm still your high priest. And God says, their ruler shall come out from their midst. I will make him draw near, and he shall approach me. for who will dare himself to approach me? As one writer put it, this is the depiction of the Messiah who's going to be the mediator between God and man. A beautiful picture that he incorporates two roles, both king and priest. Because they come from different lines. If you're the king, you weren't supposed to be the priest, and vice versa. So the beautiful picture here at this time is that you had strong leaders, even though they were in the minority, like a Joshua and a Zerubbabel and a Ezra. They bring people together as one man. That's good leadership, brings people together, and it helps to overcome problems. So they built an offer to God, and they brought people together. And it was centered on the Word. So to conclude, I'm going to tie the knot here, link things. So Joshua in the Old Testament, his name, Yeshua, God saves. Jesus' name, same name, Yeshua, God saves people from their sins. Jesus has that name, that he's going to save us from our sins. So the good news from exiles is that God will be gracious to us because he's anointed his promised one to proclaim good news to the poor. These people were poor in both spirit and literally. He is sent to proclaim liberty to the captives. If you've never been in exile, never been in jail, you're thinking, I don't know what the big deal about this is. He delivers us from all forms of captivity, whether it's psychological, whether it's moral, whether it's physical. He can set at liberty those who are oppressed. And these people were oppressed for hundreds of years, waiting for a Messiah to deliver them. The good news about Joshua, the priest of both Old and New Testament, because he was one of them. He was poor. He was in exile. He wasn't born here. He's a foreigner. He's an alien. But he could identify with his people. Like, I'm one of you guys. I know what you're going through. And therefore, he can empathize with us. And he was a good high priest. He had compassion on his people. And we're told, likewise, another Joshua comes along, that we can come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. Just like that Joshua, who could feel the pain and the distress of his countrymen, he came back in shambles. You guys look like burnt wood. You're burnt out and you're useless. But he had compassion on his people. He says, I'm like one of you guys. And that's what Jesus does for us. He's both merciful and faithful. He's touched with the infirmities of us. He knows what it's like to be in exile. He was born basically homeless, in a homeless shelter in a manger. He's been tempted like in all points like we are. He's not different than us. He's got the same stuff as us, the same flesh, the same garment that people consider dirty or just, no high priest should be wearing that. But like Jesus in the New Testament, Joshua was one of high priests who could deal gently with the ignorant and misguided. He knows what it's like to be in exile, since he himself was like that at one point. So I'm going to conclude with this verse here, these two verses. So the remnant that comes back from Babylon, freed by the Persians, were in the province who had survived. They came back to that little province of Judea. They'd survived the exile. They were in great trouble and shame. Ever feel like that? That's what the people were, the shape and the condition they were in. They needed a high priest who could help them, who could identify with them and say, yeah, I know what you mean. I've gone the same journey from Babylon back here. I know exactly what you guys are thinking and feeling. I can identify and empathize with you. Some people might think, oh, you guys you look dirty and filthy. Like, just get out of our sight. We're holy, holier than thou. And so you see what's going on there? But in Hebrews chapter 2, it says, Jesus is one who can make people holy, and those who are made holy are of the same family. It's the 12 tribes. You guys are no different than us. He's trying to say, look, we're all one family here. So Jesus, or Yeshua, Joshua, is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. The implication, you read the book of Hebrews, they were in a bad spot. You talk about being ostracized and sort of out on an island by yourself when they left the Jewish community. Where are we going to find a place to call home? They were exiles, even out of their own families and their own synagogues. Fortunately, Jesus says of Jesus, he's not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. Irrespective of what we look like, where we come from, he and we share something in common, human nature. And he says, you know what? I'm going to give you guys new garments. I'm going to redeem you and exalt you, and you're my brothers and sisters, and I will take care of you and basically save you out of really horrible conditions. And this is a horrible condition. So hopefully you get the lesson here from Zechariah chapter 3. This was an incredible man who came back to save his people. And Jesus does the same thing for us.